I respectfully disagree. I think they will manage to escape any major repercussions. It seems entirely cynical, and I believe they'll largely avoid serious fallout. What have they done, really? They've alienated the pensioners, but those are voters who weren't supporting them in the first place. Keir Starmer stood confidently before the cameras, seemingly assured of his decision. But what followed caught everyone off guard. Rod Liddle, ever sharp and unflinching, launched a scathing attack on Starmer during a live broadcast, tearing into his cold, calculated move to cut the winter fuel allowance. This was more than just a policy dispute. It felt like a slow-motion disaster unfolding on live TV. The anger among those who felt abandoned, especially the pensioners, was palpable, and even members of Starmer's own party began to distance themselves from him. The question is, how long can Starmer hold it together before his party fractures beyond repair? Let's get into the numbers first. 9 out of 10 pensioners will lose their winter fuel payment, a sum that could be as much as £300, right at the most challenging time of the year. For millions of elderly citizens, especially those on fixed incomes, this decision feels like a cruel blow. Labor's decision to cut the winter fuel allowance has sent shockwaves across the country. Even though the payment, which costs around £1.4 billion, is a relatively small part of government spending, it's a lifeline for many vulnerable pensioners. But under Keir Starmer's leadership, the party decided to stick with this highly unpopular policy, no matter the cost. The public outcry was immediate, particularly among older citizens who rely on this payment to heat their homes during bitterly cold winters. The cut wasn't just perceived as a financial move. It felt like a heartless decision, one that seemed disconnected from the everyday struggles of pensioners. And when Starmer returned to Westminster, he quickly realized just how many of his own MPs couldn't stomach this choice. The backlash was swift and harsh. 50 Labour MPs abstained from the vote, clearly uncomfortable with supporting a policy so unpopular, but not quite brave enough to publicly oppose their leader. Only one MP had the courage to directly vote against it. Even John McDonnell, a key figure in the Labour Party for years, couldn't stay silent. He gave a blistering speech, accusing Starmer of being indifferent to the very people Labour is supposed to protect. For McDonnell and many others, this wasn't about saving money. It felt like a deliberate move to punish those who didn't vote for Labour in the last election. Pork barrel politics at its finest. What Starmer is doing, as Liddle pointed out, is rewarding the groups that support him and turning his back on those who didn't. Liddle, never one to mince words, tore into Starmer for what he saw as a cold, calculated betrayal of pensioners, a demographic that tends to lean conservative anyway. In Liddle's no-nonsense style, he pointed out that Starmer's decision seemed purely political. Starmer wasn't worried about losing pensioners' votes because they weren't Labour supporters to begin with. According to Liddle, Starmer's entire strategy has been built on playing political favorites, rewarding the groups that helped him rise to power and ignoring the ones who didn't. It's a cynical calculation, but Liddle argued that Starmer was paying off his political debts by favoring certain voter blocs while showing little to no concern for pensioners who are now left out in the cold, literally and figuratively. Liddle's critique went further, painting Starmer as out of touch with the real struggles of the elderly. Imagine being a pensioner, barely scraping by during the winter months, waiting for that winter fuel payment to arrive so you can keep the heat on. And then, out of nowhere, you hear that the Labour Party, the party that has long championed the vulnerable, has slashed it. The anger from pensioners is understandable. They're not living in luxury. They're trying to survive on limited incomes, and now they feel abandoned by the very people who are supposed to represent them. Rod Liddle made it abundantly clear that Starmer's decision was more than a political blunder. It was a betrayal. Starmer didn't just make a mistake. He made a calculated decision to turn his back on the elderly, according to Liddle. And from a political standpoint, Liddle pointed out how foolish this was. Sure, pensioners may not have been Labour supporters, but alienating an entire demographic like this is a dangerous game. Pensioners are a vocal group, and they vote in large numbers. Some of them may have been Labour supporters at one time, but after this, it's hard to imagine them feeling anything but abandoned. Cutting the winter fuel payment wasn't just about trimming the budget. It's about survival for many of these people. And Starmer's leadership team didn't seem to fully grasp that. Even longtime Labor stalwart John McDonnell couldn't hold back. McDonnell, who has often been at odds with Starmer, delivered a fiery speech that laid bare the real impact of this decision. McDonnell argued that pensioners who had contributed to society for decades were now being left out in the cold, both figuratively and literally. What's truly shocking is that Little, a conservative commentator known for tearing into left-wing figures, found himself agreeing with McDonnell, a figure from the far left wing of the Labor Party. Just think about that, a conservative and a socialist on the same page. That's how bad this decision was. Even Little, who is usually quick to criticize McDonnell, had to acknowledge that McDonnell was right on this issue. If that doesn't show just how off-course Starmer's decision was, nothing will. McDonnell's speech struck a chord with many. He didn't just criticize the policy, he made it personal. He talked about the pensioners who had worked hard all their lives, only to now be left in the cold by a party that was supposed to represent their interests. It was a powerful moment, and even those who usually disagree with McDonnell couldn't deny that he was speaking the truth. And Little, who has never been a fan of McDonnell, found himself nodding along in agreement. In fact, Little even joked that he disliked Starmer so much in that moment, he was agreeing with McDonnell, a sentence he probably never thought he'd say. But that's the reality of how disastrous this decision was. Starmer has managed to unite people who are normally on opposite ends of the political spectrum, all against him. Little didn't stop there. He continued his takedown of Starmer, focusing on his entire track record since taking over as Labor leader. Little pointed out how Starmer has been all over the place with his policies, trying to please everyone but ultimately pleasing no one. Take, for example, his decision to give massive pay raises to junior doctors who are already earning six-figure salaries. Meanwhile, pensioners who are struggling to heat their homes in the winter are left out in the cold. It's like Starmer is playing a twisted game, where he's bending over backward to appease certain groups, like the unions and public sector workers, while completely ignoring the needs of others like pensioners. And that's where it all falls apart. By alienating pensioners, Starmer has isolated a significant portion of the electorate, people who may not have been Labor supporters to begin with, but whose goodwill he has now completely squandered. This isn't just a minor misstep, it's a disaster. The fallout from this decision has been catastrophic, not just in terms of public outrage, but within the Labor Party itself. About 50 Labor MPs abstained from the vote, refusing to openly oppose the party, but also not willing to support such an unpopular decision. That's a massive crack in what was once a united party under Starmer's leadership. The foundation is crumbling, and Starmer's grip on power is slipping. Rod Little didn't hold back in pointing out how politically suicidal this move was. He called it what it is, a complete disaster. And the worst part? Starmer and his shadow chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who backed this decision, seemed oblivious to the storm that was coming their way. They either didn't see it or thought they could weather it without facing any real consequences. But as Little pointed out, they are in for a rude awakening. They didn't just underestimate the public's anger, they also misjudged the internal response from their own party. Longtime Labor MPs, people who have been loyal to the party for years, are now openly questioning Starmer's leadership. This isn't just a policy failure, it's a public relations disaster. Starmer's refusal to back down, his decision to dig in his heels rather than admit the mistake, only makes things worse. It's almost as if he's doubling down on a bad decision, and now even his own party's left wondering how long it will be before the whole situation blows up in his face. So, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think Starmer will be able to hold on, or has he alienated too many people to survive this political storm? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, take care, and goodbye.